During my university study, the colonial army in the Dutch East Indies, nowadays Indonesia, was my major. To give you an idea about the size of the Dutch East Indies, I have projected the ultimate size of it on the map of Europe. The so-called Aceh War between 1873 and 1912 was one of the fiercest struggles during the Dutch conquest of the Indonesian archipelago. During this war of attrition, which absorbed the bulk of the Dutch colonial army, new tactics were developed, which led to the creation of the Marshal Corps, or in Dutch, Marechaussee. Historically, the Dutch colonial army was from its creation in 1816 organized like a conventional European army. In practice, the army was often confronted with local irregular forces. In Aceh, the Dutch colonial forces were once again confronted with a foe which used hit-and-run tactics. In the beginning, the Dutch tried to counter these with a defense perimeter, but this did not decrease insurgent activity. In 1890, the Marshal Corps was established as a separate and specialized force within the Dutch colonial army. It was a break with the formal organization of the army in conventional army battalions with a lot of European soldiers. The Marshal units were small-scale platoon-sized units and consisted entirely of indigenous personnel, but the officers were Dutch. In the 1890s, the total Marshal force consisted of a few hundred men, 244 in 1890 and later expanded to 362 men in 1897. Initially, the Marshal Corps was used as light infantry to cover transport convoys and columns of regular infantry against ambushes. In 1897, Commander Graafland got permission to use his corps more aggressively in action against insurgents by patrolling and pursuing them. The Marshal Corps was selected and trained for this purpose by practicing jungle crossings, night patrolling and close combat. For these reasons, it was lightly armed with carabine and a klewang. A klewang was a large knife which was used for cutting through jungle foliage, but it was also used in close combat with the enemy. This relatively light armament increased the mobility which it needed to pursue the enemy. The Marshal Corps was used from 1897 on to reverse the role of the Dutch in the Aceh War from being the hunted into being the hunters. The corps would defeat the insurgents on their own terms by going on their terrain and using their way of waging war, which meant in close combat. Marshals were discouraged to use their carabine and encouraged to use their klewang to confront their enemies. The marshals would patrol day and night and go where other soldiers would not go, if needed, through the jungle's foliage. They would relentlessly pursue any enemy who attacked the Dutch perimeter, and they tried to collect intelligence from locals about the enemy. Although their numbers were small, the Marshal units were instrumental in the establishment of Dutch control over Aceh between 1897 and 1912. Large areas were pacified by their presence, and the insurgency was largely defeated by their tactics to hunt down the enemy. This came with a heavy price in civilian lives, as terror was used as a weapon by both sides. The marshals are recorded to have killed whole villages, including women and children. The success of the Marshal Corps was reflected by the adoption of its tactics and outfit by the bulk of the Dutch colonial army. The army was gradually transformed into a more lightly armed policing force, like the marshals. This coincided with the end of colonial expansion and the demand for a force to patrol the extensive possessions of the Dutch colonial empire in the east and quell local rebellions. Although the Aceh War was formally ended before World War I, the region remained restive until the end of Dutch colonial rule in 1949. The Marshal Corps was in many ways the precursor of what we call now special forces. They were selected soldiers which were purposely trained for counter-insurgency jungle warfare. They were required to have a high level of stamina, endurance and bravery. They were supposed to go where regular soldiers would not go, and confront the enemy in close combat, wherever they find them in day or night operations. They were a true elite force, even by modern standards.